that means to live our lives at this interesting time in history. So what are we up against? In the Jesus versus Caesar book, I made the argument that what we're up against is not always what it seems like. You know, for people of faith, Christians, sometimes we're told we're up against people who don't believe. You know, we're up against atheism, or we're up against other religions, we're in competition with them, things like that, you know. We're up against secularism and all of this. That's one way to look at it if you're a person of faith, but there's another way that's perhaps more interesting and more relevant for us. Because it seems to me, and that's an argument I made back in that book, was perhaps as Christians today, we're up against Christianity itself. Or maybe a form of Christianity that might or might not be Christianity. This reminds me as part of my own history. So if you're wondering where this accent is coming from, it's not a Tennessee accent. It's also not a Texas accent where I taught for 22 years. It's a German Methodist accent, so you get a little bit of this from the South. And growing up in the German Methodist Church, of course, we had this history in Germany, looking back, of what was called, in the days before I was born, between 1933 and 1945, the Kirchenkampf, the church struggle. What the churches were up against at that time was actually Christianity itself, because the German Protestant church especially was used by Adolf Hitler to make a case for fascism. And so the church was taken over by these forces that then, of course, you know the history, right, led to World War II and the concentration camps and the Holocaust. So Christianity was part of that. We sometimes forget it. We think these were just some bad politicians, but Christianity in so many ways was part of it. The Deutsche Christen, the German Christians, were the Christians that were part of the problem at the time. And so maybe we're at a time again where as Christians we have to figure out what are we up against today. What is it that Christianity serves? Who's the God that we're worshiping? And I think this is, in our own time, we can figure this out together. The challenge where when people say God and Christianity, we may not always mean the same thing, right? And that's a conversation we now need to have. I don't know if you're talking much about dominionism here in Kansas, but that's certainly a conversation down south where dominionism is this idea that Christianity should take over all of life. There's the 7 mountains mandate, 7 aspects of society that believers are supposed to dominate, and that includes family, religion, education, media, arts, entertainment, business, and government. Arts and entertainment is the same, so this is how it gets to 7. That's dominionism, basically thinking Christianity has to dominate this and to be right on top and tell everybody else what to do. So when people then say theocracy, they think there's some very stern-faced Christian God at the top, and everybody else has to do what this God says. Now, Jesus' mountain mandate is actually different. You may know a story early on in the Gospels. This is from the Temptations, where the devil leads Jesus on a very high mountain, and there tells him, I will give you power over all the kingdoms of this earth if you fall down and worship me. And you know Jesus' response, right? That's why it was a temptation, because Jesus maybe had to think about it for a moment. You know, having power over all the kingdoms of the world sounds really tempting. You know, this is your 7 mountains mandate. Having power over everything, controlling everything, that's very interesting. And you know, if Jesus would have thought, well, wait a minute, right now the devil is promising me this. If I wait 3 years, I will get the same thing from God. That would have been a bit of a temptation, but not that much, right? Just wait and you'll get the same thing from God afterwards. The way I read this is Jesus' mountain mandate is to say, this is not how God runs the world. It's not like the emperors over all the kingdoms, but Jesus actually had to make a decision and to say how is God at work in the world? Is it this way or another way? And Jesus says, no thank you to the devil, and decided to live a very different life, to do a very different ministry, and this is why we're here tonight. So there's a church struggle already in the very beginning, right, in Jesus' own life. Then you have it again and again, and I think we're at this point now where we have to make some decisions about what is Christianity, what do we say, who we are, how do we go forward. All right, next slide. This is a famous one, right? The full text, of course, you know, comes from Mark chapter 12, starts in verse 28 with the scribe asking Jesus, which commandment is the first of all? And Jesus then answers, the first is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So now we're at the heart of the Christian traditions. Keep in mind that this is something that Jesus, of course, doesn't pull out of a hat. It comes from the Hebrew Bible. It comes from our traditions. But Jesus puts it together. There's not a place in the Hebrew Bible or the so-called Old Testament where these two things are together. They're both there, but in different places. And so Jesus puts this together and says, this is what the commandments are, this is what your religion is ultimately all about. So as we rethink now what is Christianity, who is the true God, let's start right there. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Next slide. This is, however, more a question than an answer just yet. So who is God, right? Who are we talking about when we say God? One way to trick a lot of Christians, I think, especially at this point in our history, is to say, when you say God and when I say God, we mean the same thing. And that is about the furthest from the truth, right? When I say God, I mean perhaps something different. When somebody else says God, the question is, what do you mean, right? Let's talk about this. And here I put together a couple of images, a bit tongue-in-cheek. I promised Jeff that there will be some jokes also, so you can laugh at this one. But think about it. These are typical God images that we have, right? We have God sitting on a throne. God, of course, where this is coming from is from the old empires. Christianity was born under the confines of the Roman Empire, and this is how it starts, right? Jesus then gets identified in terms of the empire too, then God sits on a throne, Jesus sits on a throne as well, and here the idea is God is at the very top of the universe. And if you ask the theologians, you know, you go through the ages, and you have somebody like Anselm of Canterbury in the Middle Ages who says, God is that than which nothing greater can be perceived. So you think about what's on the top, and then God's just a little higher, but in the same direction. That's one way to answer the God question, right? You look to the most powerful, the wealthiest, the most important people, and you say, well, this is what God is like, just a tad higher. And of course, you see the insignia, right? You see the old thrones and the royal insignia. Today it's more a business suit and a tie. The end is the same. You know, God is somehow at the top of the universe. And that's what then theocracy means, you know, that God somehow rules through the wealthy and the powerful. That's a typical conservative trope. You know this. I mean, people in Kansas certainly come, you know, close to that, and then people say, what's the matter with Kansas? Well, you know, of course, it's the same in Tennessee. I just spent 5 weeks in Australia, Fiji, and New Zealand. It's the same there, too. Everybody always looks up when they want to talk about God. And then liberal Christians come along and say, well, we can't quite go along with all these images. We need something a little better. But then, you know, usually it ends up with definitions of God as somehow a higher power, right? This is what you get in various liberal theologies. You know, maybe you don't get the person on the throne or the person with the tie, but it's still a higher power somewhere up there. What that means is that a lot of our images of God are shaped by the dominant powers of the day, and that's perhaps not surprising. But what I want to talk about is the alternatives. What else could we be talking about? So let's go to the next slide and think a little bit more about which God, who is God. And here we have three examples. I call them Abrahamic images of God, because Abrahamic means here, of course, this is one of our Christian forefathers, but Abraham is also the forefather of the Jewish religion, as you know, and Abraham is one of the forefathers of Islam. So we actually have the three traditions, and when you look at creation, you have, of course, the Hebrew Bible, you have the Christian Bible, and you have the Quran. Now, there are some stories in the Bible about creation. The creationists oftentimes miss this, of God making Adam from clay and planting a garden. That sounds fairly mundane, and people say, well, this is just another set of human images. Well, it's certainly a set of human images, but think about what it is not. It is not God as the employer who employs some potters and says, you make me a human being out of clay, or some agricultural worker sends them into the field and says, you plant my garden. It's God actually doing the menial labor. God doing the work, getting the divine hands dirty, as it were, coming up with some dirt under the fingernails at night. You know what it feels like to work in the garden. Take these as images of God that have some theological weight, not just as sort of naive little pictures, but think about God as joining the labor force and thereby transforming who we think is God. I mean, that's sort of a big step right there. And people might say, well, it's the same thing, right? Either you think of God in the image of the boss, or you think of God in the image of the workers, but it may not be the same thing. One comes sort of natural. By the way, I could give you a Wesleyan lecture here. Wesley was very suspicious of religion going from the top down. Wesley was much more interested in religion going from the bottom up. And so this is the working God who then gets the divine hands dirty. And this is a story you also have in the Quran. So the Quran also talks about Adam being formed from clay or from dust. And that's a remarkable conversation here, right? Thinking about God from the bottom up among the people. By the way, if you look for working images of God, the whole Hebrew Bible is full of them. You know, you have God as a potter here, right? You have God as an agriculture worker, a metal worker, you know, cleaning, sewing, various other labor images, and oftentimes female images. So God is not only doing menial labor, but God is doing the work that was traditionally relegated to women. That's theologically significant, I would say, as we're rethinking God. The next one, the Exodus story, well, that too is in all the three Abrahamic traditions. And what is that story, right? It's talking about God on the side of the Hebrew slaves and not on the side of the Pharaoh. So God is sort of shifting sides, as it were. The big miracle of the burning bush, as far as I'm concerned, is not that there's a bush in the desert that burns and is not consumed, but that there is in the desert a bush out of which God says some pretty radical stuff. What does God say? Well, I have heard your cry, and I have seen what's going on. I have seen the misery, and now let's liberate. That's the miracle, as far as I'm concerned, that you have a divine figure who is now not either on the side of the Pharaoh or maybe a little more removed, you know, with the liberal ideas of God as sort of the neutral power above the clouds looking down, always observing, perhaps being the higher power. But now you have God as a power on the side of the people who are struggling. This is a God who takes sides. And then, of course, it's not just God who takes sides, but it's the people. And by the way, the old Exodus story is not just about Moses. They're the Hebrew midwives that save Moses' life, Shipra and Purah. There's, the mother, the sister. There's Pharaoh's daughter, who is also part of the solidarity here of the slaves who takes Moses in. In the Islamic traditions, in the Quran, in the end, it is Pharaoh's wife. This is something we don't have in the Jewish and the Christian traditions. Pharaoh's wife who takes the sides of the Hebrew slaves. So that shows you, this is everybody's involved here in a different kind of solidarity. And so it's not just God taking sides. It's a whole new way of life that emerges out of the empire into liberation. The final one here, again, that may be a little funny one, Christmas, right? the image shows the Christmas tree. But think about Christmas too, what was the option here before the divine? Well, so this is the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus now is born, fully God, fully human. And we're so used to the old story that we don't think about what the options were. I mean, think about, put yourself in the place of God. If you wanted to have your kid born in the world and really make a difference, where would that kid be born, right? Would you put him in some unknown family somewhere in the backcountry? Or maybe would you make sure that the kid gets born in some prominent family somewhere in the city, right? Big family, big name, perhaps a priest, high priest, or perhaps the kid of the governor. But that's the decision. Jesus gets born in a working class family. By the way, the old term carpenter is not so much about woodwork, it's about construction work. And what Jesus and his contemporaries were doing was really building big construction projects for the Romans, not too far away from where he grew up. And in these big construction projects, the workers were treated very much like immigrant construction workers are treated today. No water, hard work, long hours. When the project was done, you're sent away and you're unemployed. So all this stuff was part of Jesus' legacy. Probably experienced some of that himself. So Christmas here too is really reshaping our image of God in a way that's totally surprising. You didn't quite expect God doing that kind of stuff. Oh, and then by the way, now you have the choir of heavenly angels. That's a cool one, right? I mean, you have the heavenly PR machine, God's social media, as it were. And now what are you doing with them? If you had that opportunity, wouldn't you send them at least to Jerusalem in the Temple Square, or maybe to Rome even, make a big pronouncement. People, we saw thousands of angels, and that goes down through the literature and the Roman philosophers and the historians. Well, instead, you know the story, right? God sends this heavenly choir of angels out into the fields to people who are basically herding somebody else's sheep. The shepherds weren't even the owners of their own flock. They were the people who were out there, hired to do somebody else's dirty work. But this is where the choirs of angels go. So that should do a little bit of something here already to adjust our images of God. Okay, so having talked about God here a bit, so this is the love of God, right? So you're loving a God that is very surprising, I mean, to say the least, right? This is not just, let's just look up to the sky. Let's look around and see where God is in the world. Next slide. So now let's move on to the second part. Love God, very odd God, certainly not the wrong God anymore. Something is happening. Now let's talk about the neighbor, because those things are connected, right? So love God, says Jesus, and love your neighbor. Those are the two most important things. Certainly for Christianity, let's stay there. By the way, on Sunday morning, I hope you'll be back, because we'll conclude this with a sermon on John Wesley, who had some very interesting things to say about this as well, and a lot of Methodists forgot about that. So we'll make the Wesleyan turn on Sunday morning. So a little cliffhanger to make sure some of you come back. Hope I didn't push you too hard tonight, but there's more to be said. So, but what is this love of neighbor thing, right? It's a Wesleyan thing, we know that. But what does it look like? So the first way, this is how I was raised, by the way, in the German Methodist Church, where my family had been for 5 generations when I was born. So I'm the 5th generation here of a very odd, small church in the country of Germany. We basically heard this is a moral appeal. Love your neighbor is you must love your neighbor. And you know how these moral appeals usually go, right? Some authority figure tells you, now it's me, could be Jeff from the pulpit, saying you all must love your neighbors. And you know how well that goes, right? Because people always do what people say on the pulpit. Probably that's one of the frustrations of many years of preaching, right? That sometimes you're not getting the word out. And that's just life, not anybody to be blamed. This is not to say we need to moralize even more. But moralizing is often sort of a dead end, it doesn't quite get us where we want to go. And so I want to move beyond this very quickly and to ask the question, what might be the deeper connections here? So let's talk a little bit more about the neighbor, and then we'll come back talking about God again, and you see what difference that makes. So next slide. So growing up in the Methodist Church, this goes back to the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s. Most of this was a moral thing. You had to love your neighbor, and if you didn't, you were going to go to hell or something like that. It didn't help, and so around the late 70s, German Methodists became more liberal, and people were saying, I started hearing pastors saying is, if you really want to love your neighbor, you have to love yourself first. And that came as a bit of a relief, to say, well, it's not just about others. You can actually pay attention to yourself. You're somebody as well. You have to love yourself first. And that certainly was a time that was pretty fun in the church, because this is now when Methodist churches in Germany started to renovate their buildings. We tore out all the pews. We put in chairs, make it more comfortable, right? You're still sitting on pews. So you still have to love yourself a bit more, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, that approach too started to get stuck, because once you start with yourself, you usually get stuck with yourself, even if you mean well. And so, I'll give you an example. There was, of course, a time, and that is coming back again, when people look at other people and they're wondering if they're fully human. During slavery, the idea was that an African-American person was not 100% human. Now people are wondering, what about immigrants? They're certainly not 100% American, maybe not American at all. Nobody's talking yet about other people's humanity, but the question is, are they even fully human? So a nice liberal response to that is to say, others are people just like us. And that is progress. If you've been raised to believe others are not fully human, somebody saying to you, others are people just like us, is certainly the right direction in which to go, right? They too are people like us. Better than others are not like us, and we should kick them out. So others are people like us, but there's still something missing here. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So think about this for a moment. It's better to say others are people like us than to reject others. But there's one more step that I want to go to next. So the next slide helps us get to that. The relationship of neighbor and self. We've been so led to believe that individualism is the way the world goes that we forgot something. Individualism, of course, tells you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And some of us might have done it to some degree, but it's probably physically not possible to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And individualism covers up the fact that all of us owe a debt of gratitude to other people. I mean, you can try this, go home, tell your relatives, tell your parents, tell people and say, I have raised myself. And your mom will set you straight. They will say, no, you did not. Somebody cleaned your diapers and it wasn't you. And it probably wasn't your dad either, but somebody cleaned your diapers, right? Here's something. Think about why you're speaking English. It's not because you're born speaking English, but because your community spoke English. This is how you learn your language. Think about, all the things that you have and that you are, and what you realize is we're not self-made people, right? So individualism is really a lie. And the idea that the self is out there by itself, basically able to do whatever it wants, that's not true. By the way, this is a cover-up. This is the story that people at the very top tell other people so that they think they're the greatest. I alone can fix it, right? As some of the top politicians has been repeating. The assumption is, I got myself there, I made all of this happen. But the truth is, people, the higher you go, the less an individual you are, because you're benefiting from everybody else's work. You're benefiting from everybody else's life. You're benefiting from the community in a way that has to be expressed. So what I'm saying here is there's a connection between neighbor and self that is usually not openly admitted, but we have to talk about it. So that's the love of neighbor story I want to explore here a bit. There were two famous Jewish philosophers. You probably heard at least of one of them. Martin Buber was a Jewish philosopher who worked on some of these questions. The other one, Buber, grew up in Vienna, German-speaking, ended up in Jerusalem, where he passed away at a mature age. You had Buber, and then you had Emmanuel Levinas, who was a French Jewish philosopher. And both of them somehow understood this part of, the Hebrew teachings, their own traditional teachings, not as saying you must love your neighbor or love yourself first, but simply as saying the neighbor is part of who you are. You might not realize it, but your neighbor is always part of who you are. You just have to recognize it. That was one of the big things, to say, well, your neighbor is part of yourself. So when there's now talk about love of neighbor, it's not you must love somebody else, but just become aware of who's already part of you and now build that relationship. So that's a new way of thinking about it, right? Love of neighbor is not here I am, here's the other person, but let's think about how we're already connected. Now, this is something that other important historical figures have realized as well, one of them being the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul at one point talks about the body of Christ. You know the famous story in 1 Corinthians 12 about the church as the body of Christ. And he ends it by saying, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And then the second part of that is, if one member rejoices, all rejoice together with it. And then, there's other stuff in this passage where he says, the head cannot say to the feet, I have no need of you. The eyes cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. So Paul was really clear about how the body is always connected. Now, the Romans knew that too, by the way. This is an old Roman imperial image about how the body is so wonderfully, organically connected. And you can get a whole sermon series out of wonderful organic connection until you talk about how it is. And Paul realizes something that is oftentimes overlooked because he says the members of the body that seem to are indispensable. The weaker members are indispensable. The hand cannot say to the I have no need of you. The head cannot say to the feet, I have no need of you. It's a bit what's happening in the economy today, though. You can lay off all the federal workers, seemingly because you have no need of them, without recognizing that this is the way the work gets done, right? You can sort of produce leaner and meaner without recognizing that the work actually still gets done by working people. This is what makes the wheels go round. And Paul knew that. So this connection of self and neighbor now gets really interesting because it's a very close connection. It's not just a nice idea, but let's talk about how what happens to the neighbor actually happens to all of us. So take that back now, next slide, to the question of God. This now goes further into the New Testament. This is from 1 John 4, verse 20. Those who say, I love God and hate a brother or sister are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. So this relationship to other people now has something to do and feeds back into our relationship with God. Let me say it differently. If you cannot respect your neighbor, you probably cannot respect God. If you cannot respect the people with whom you're close together, you cannot respect God. And that's not just a romantic image about your friends. This is especially an image about people that you might rather ignore or perhaps not even talk to. That's the point here. So this love your neighbor as yourself business now is not so much a moral imperative or a nice little idea, but it is a way by which to live your life. Realize who you're connected with, engage those people, and as you do so, you become more fully human, and you will find out a few things about God that may be really surprising. And of course, we'll talk about that more on Sunday morning. This means something for the way we read the Bible, because you now read the Bible with new eyes. This is different now when you pray, because you're no longer just between Jesus and you. It's now between the world and Jesus and you. We'll talk about that Sunday morning. So there's some really exciting stuff, but let's spell this out a bit more. So once you start figuring out some of these connections, everything else falls into place. Everything else is different. But now we have a task. Now we have a project. Now we can say, let's figure out who our neighbors are, and in the same breath, let's figure out who is God. So if you cannot respect neighbors, you cannot respect God. The tremendous disrespect that I see in our society today for so many people, not just for people who look different, but also for people who think differently, who talk differently, who have different ideas. That, I would argue here, is what actually does us in, and this is why we're worshiping these false gods, because not respecting people, we're also not able to respect the true God. And so we make our own little gods in our own images, which is perhaps natural, but very hard, and in the end, perhaps a matter of life and death. Let me put it differently one more time. It's sort of all repeating what 1 John 4 says. So if you cannot respect your neighbor, you cannot respect God. If you cannot relate, if you cannot build relationships to your neighbor, you cannot build relationships to God. This takes you back to this idea of others are people just like us. That's the first step. But the next step, and this is where we're headed, we'll work on this tomorrow in the workshops especially, is the question, what if we turn this around, instead of saying others are people just like us, to say maybe we're people like others. So now you're looking at the other person, not just in terms of your own self. You're now asking questions, who am I? How can I become a person in relation to this other person? And how can I become who I'm truly meant to be? That's the question. So others are people like us is nice, but asking the question, how are we like others, may be where we can truly learn something. That's the point of diversity in the church, by the way. This is the point of the open table in United Methodism. Not just because we want to have a lot more people in our pews, but because we might understand better who we are if we relate to different people. We might, of course, down the road understand better who God is as well. Okay, a few more slides. Next one, please. So this is now the conversation about solidarity. That's a term I coined about 2011 in the wake of the Occupy Wall Street movement, where we are talking about solidarity a lot, but there's something deep about solidarity here that might explain better what I'm talking about. So this love of neighbor, love of God business, what happens when we talk about that in terms of solidarity? Well, the one thing we have to realize is if individualism is the myth, is the lie of the powerful, most of us who are not at the top of the world could learn something from seeing through that lie. Because, the rest of us, we're oftentimes led to believe that if you do something really great, you can change the world. And that's never the truth. They always get us theologians with this too. So here I am, a professor, an elite professor at an elite university, and I should be able to change the world just by speaking to crowds of people, right? But the truth is, it doesn't quite work like that. So if you really want to make a difference, the point here is you might need solidarity. You cannot do it by yourself. So even those of us who have been led to believe that our privileges give us all this influence, we have to realize that we can only do it together. Those of you who are United Methodists, you might remember the United Methodist mission statement, right? At one point they said it was about making disciples for Jesus Christ. And then at the next general conference, they said that wasn't quite it yet. So they said our mission is to make disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's now in the book of Discipline. If you haven't seen it, Google it. It's very interesting how these two things come together, right? For the transformation of the world. But I submit to you, you are not going to transform this world by yourself. And even you and your friends might not be able to do it. So now we need something a little bit bigger. And in order sort of to complete this love your neighbor as yourself and love God business, we need to think bigger. So this is not just about you and me. This is about all of us. And how do we build it? And keep in mind the old stories I just told you earlier. I mean, especially the Exodus story. It is about a story of God being in solidarity as well. So this is not just a practical thing for those of us who want to change the world. This is how God changes the world. This is how Jesus changes the world after having turned down the devil's offer of top-down power. Okay, so what do we do with that, right? How do we now build power together? Next slide. There's something called false solidarity, and I think as we move towards the real solidarity, you really have to see the tricks that are being played of us. In the old days of the monarchy and of the empires, of course, it was pretty clear how the powerful stayed in power. I mean, you stayed in power because you were born into a certain family and you said God was on your side. That became more difficult, with the American Revolution. Why? Well, because now King George couldn't tell you what to do anymore, and we went sort of towards a democracy, which certainly is something that took a while, right? At first, it was just a couple of handful of white males who owned property that had the right to vote, and now every citizen has the right to vote. So now the people at the top have a bit of a problem, right? How do you keep voting so that they stay in power and you think you're part of it? Well, false solidarity is the answer. It's a little easier when you have not a democracy, but now that we have, the question is how do we build this? Next slide. Part of that false solidarity is a term I think I have coined. I haven't found this anywhere else, unite and conquer. You all know about divide and conquer, right? You divide people and then you have the power. Unite and conquer is something that is also part of our history. I have a book here. This is Lerone Bennett, A History of Black America. That's the subtitle, I think. The title is Before the Mayflower. And what Bennett is talking about is very interesting. 17th century Virginia, you had white and black people working together in the fields. They were all sharecroppers. This was right before slavery, chattel slavery. But they were working together in the fields, black and white people, and they realized they had a lot in common. So there was solidarity emerging, which was worrisome to the white masters. And so the white masters invented something that is still very much alive and well, which was called racism. And they did it in this way. They gave the white sharecroppers some slight privileges, and they made the white sharecroppers believe you have more in common with the white masters than with the black sharecroppers. And so racism here was to suggest to the white sharecroppers, don't pay attention to these black people, pay attention to your white masters because they are like you. They're people like you. But you can see what happened, right? Unite and conquer here now led to uniting white people, and who was conquered? In old 17th century Virginia, it's pretty clear the black sharecroppers were conquered, but who else was conquered with them? That was the point of racism. The white sharecroppers were also conquered. So your white supremacy today goes sort of something like this, right? You have a lot of white people thinking we're all supreme together, and that now conquers all non-white people. But when you think again and when you turn around again, you realize that this is a story that's told to the white people. We're all white supreme together. And in the end, there are some people more supreme than others. In other words, a lot of the people that are led to believe in this myth of white supremacy are now duped to think, I'm now made great again, while nothing changes. And not only does nothing change, things get worse. Also for white people in this country. So this is how unite and conquer works. Racism is an example. Sexism too. Men are often led to believe that they have something when they do their thing over women that makes them more powerful. While in reality, that conquers the women. And most men that don't realize that they might be better off if their families, if their wives, if their daughters actually made the same amount that Their white peers are making for the same work. There's some unite and conquer going on here with sexism. Certainly unite and conquer going on with nationalism. This was a lesson I eventually learned looking at the story of one of my grandfathers who was in Hitler's army. A white German, Methodist, Aryan, whatever, who fought in Hitler's army, and German nationalism made him believe this is us Germans being made great again. And then, he was held prisoner. He realized that this white supremacy, this white German nationalism thing was actually not ever supposed to work for all Germans. It was just for the German ruling class. So this is unite and conquer, where you're ultimately, keeping the elites in power. And of course, this is where your bad God images now get reinforced. You can think about this. Methodism here is a great example also, right? This is what we're seeing now with the split in Methodism. There's a lot of unite and conquer going on here. And I'm proud that you stayed the course within United Methodism. That's a great thing, not falling for some of the stories that were told. These are really unite and conquer stories as well. All right, so shallow solidarity, that's the next slide here. Just briefly, and I think we're about running out of time, so I'll take a couple of more minutes, and then we'll put this together. Shallow solidarity is a bit like saying you must love your neighbor. It's like saying you must be in solidarity. It usually does not work. Next slide. This is from Lilla Watson, who is once in a while quoted in the US. You may have heard this before. Watson, basically, her famous saying, this is to a young white activist who comes to Australia, wants to help Aboriginals. She says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. That's Watson. So unless you realize that there's this connection with the others, your solidarity might be too shallow. You're wasting your time, says Lilla Watson. But the next quote, next slide actually, is even more dramatic. This is Basil Moore, a South African theologian, saying this, I believe, in 1973 actually. Like most of us, Moore says, I'm prepared to trust and stand alongside a man, sorry, this is not yet inclusive language, but stand alongside a person who is fighting for themselves and their own freedom if I know that their freedom is bound up with mine. I cannot wholeheartedly trust a person who is fighting for me, for I fear that sooner or later they will tire of the struggle. So this is the real warning here. You may be wasting your time with this shallow solidarity, but the truth is we cannot be trusted if all you do is sort of just nicely put yourself on the side of other people. Why? Because sooner or later you will tire of the struggle. That's the problem, and I think this is what we're working on. So now find a few solutions in the last few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Next slide. This is now where this deep solidarity thing comes in, because the point here is we have to think about how we're connected. The neighbor is part of yourself. Let's think about what that looks like. Well, Paul had it right. If one member suffers, all suffer together. So let's see who's struggling these days. Let's see how that affects us. If you want to talk to me about university politics these days, we can do so afterwards. But one thing I learned about university politics was really from hanging out with Walmart workers who talked to me about Walmart politics on the shop floor. If you're somewhere in the Walmart business, often people think it's the managers who are the bad guys, but the managers too are in this struggle. It's sort of like if you're a Walmart manager and you're a university professor, you're led to believe that this is you. Well, in reality, of course, there's forces way bigger than us, and we're not the ones who are running this show either. So this thing here is, if the least of these suffer, all of us suffer, and this is what we have to learn. So here, paying attention to where suffering is happening, and we talked about this a little bit at dinner before here tonight, where the church is active. So pay attention to what's going on there, not just because you want to fix a problem, but you want to know what's going on. You want to know how are we connected and how are we in this together. I learned a lot about the university just by being in different places where power flows in a very interesting way and people are misled to believe about what's happening. So where the pressure is greatest is where solidarity emerges. And, this is the lesson that we're now deepening. A little bit of that was seen, by the way, it seems to me, in 2011 with Occupy Wall Street, where people all of a sudden said, we are the 99%. And the 99%, of course, meant there are some people that are well off, there are some people that are not so well off, but we're not winning this game. And the 1% here is a symbolic number. It's not pointing fingers at individuals. It's just saying this system works a lot better for some than for others. And for most of us, it doesn't. So once you realize that, you have a different place where you can have a conversation. And here comes two more things that are actually quite beautiful. One is, sorry, picked up this cough in New Zealand, so I'm still trying to get rid of it. Two things. You now get in this kind of solidarity, realizing we're in this together, but you also know we're not the same. We're maybe more like others than others are like us. And as you figure that out, you're now beginning to realize that difference is not a bad thing. Some people think, well, difference is the problem. Liberal people are more inclined to say we have to be tolerant. We have to be nice to people who are different. I'm here to say that difference might be part of the solution. There's not just something to be tolerated, but something that makes us stronger. So as we realize that we're in this together, we can now bring our own resources. I'm hoping that those of us who are Methodists can bring some of these Methodist resources, thus the sermon on Sunday morning. But I'm also hoping that those of us who are Christians, those of us who are Americans, and I do have a blue passport, mind you, those of us who are Americans can actually make a difference without having to hide who we are. So bring this into the conversation. At the same time, people who are not Americans are bringing something that's absolutely valuable. People who are not Christians are bringing something that is necessary. And so now you have a place of international engagement, you have a place of interreligious engagement. That's a lot more than just let's have a nice conversation with people who are different. But once you see we're in this together and the Christian brings their resources and the Jewish person, the Muslim bring their resources, all of a sudden we realize this is very powerful. We can now talk to each other. We learn better who we are in the process. And at the same time, we can really bring to bear what is the best of our own tradition. So that's the one thing I wanted to talk about. Difference here makes us stronger in the deep solidarity paradigm. So love your neighbor as yourself then makes us stronger if we realize how we're already connected. And it helps us to see a few things about God that we hadn't seen yet. The other thing, this is perhaps a cliffhanger for the workshops tomorrow. Once you approach it this way, the whole project changes, because too often, when people think, Christians have to be engaged socially, they have to help others, this is a huge drain on your energy. It's burnout that oftentimes results from it. But now, what happens when you put these things together is it's not a drain, it's actually a place where you produce energy. Building this relationship is not what sucks it out of you, but where you refuel, where you actually find God's grace at work, where you actually can find something in your life that makes you happy again, that makes you feel like things actually matter and you're making a difference. So that's the other piece here. So it's no longer somebody preaching, you must love your neighbor, and you feel bad for not doing enough. You now figure out these relationships and you see how that re-energizes you. And not just because if you're an extrovert, this is who you are, but even if you're an introvert, you now build the kinds of relationships that you need to sustain yourself. And that is exciting. By the way, there's a new term now that was just put out there in the New York Times, the introvert. There are some people who actually gain energy from relationships, but who also don't mind being by themselves for a while. So you have people. But it's not about personalities. It's about community. And what we're finding here is there's something emerging that is perhaps as exciting as the early Jesus movement, where people feel there's a different spirit. There's something going on in which I want to be a part that's changing the world. Over dinner, we were talking about some of our kids. I think once they figure that out, once they actually see there's something bigger than they are and bigger than their parents for sure, because they're not looking up to us necessarily, there's something else going on. And that's what I want to talk about. I mean, maybe we can talk about this in the conversation now. We'll talk more, Aaron and I, tomorrow in our workshops. And then Sunday sermon will be all about grace. So this is really a sermon and a presentation about the grace of God being in the world in such a way that it makes a difference. Okay, I'll end here, and now we'll open it up. And I think I'll come down from this pedestal here. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Just raise your hand if you have a question. We'll try to get to as many folks as we can. And I will hand you the microphone.
And feel free to let me have it. I mean, I think this conversation will be more interesting if you raise the real concerns and doubts that you have in response to what I just said. So.
I'm just really about to let him have it because I've read all of his books. He was a primary theologian for my doctoral work, and so to see you live is really helpful to me. One of the things that I know you say one person can't change another person's life, but you kind of did. With Christ and Empire, you talked about liminality and the space. There's dynamism in the space that we have when we're not what other people expect us to be. Now, I'm interpreting your work, by the way.
This is good. Yeah, thank you.
But I mean, that was helpful to me in terms of trying to understand people beyond kind of a binary understanding that they're either this or that. You're either documented or you're not, and that makes a difference. Or you're either man or a woman, or you're not. That makes a difference. You're either heterosexual or homosexual. We tend to do everything either or. And one of the things you talked about, I think, in God and Empire is that there is this space where it's not binary. And there's a dynamism in the space where you can make connections beyond what our expectations are. And so I was just wondering if you'd talk a little bit about liminality, the dynamism.
Yeah, those are the big philosophical words. Thanks for bringing it up. And I don't always put all these words in the presentations, but so what this is really all about, right? So we talked about relationships. And think about life really as relationship. By the way, think of God's grace also as a relationship. We sometimes think of grace as a thing or as a present or a gift or a substance, where it's all about how God relates to us and how we relate to God. And relationships are never just one way. And so the best relationship is what changes you. And even better there is, when you're surprised. So for instance, sometimes people think a good relationship is when you know everything about someone. In reality, of course, that's probably when a marriage of many years gets really either boring or dies when you feel you've figured out the other person completely. So if you cannot be surprised by someone else, even somebody very familiar anymore, that's a question. That's, of course, also the problem in relation to God. The problem with most churches is they don't want to talk about God because they think they have it all figured out. So that's the problem, right? Now we talk about it again. Liminality here means there's always gray zones. There's always space as we negotiate who we are. And of course, we change as we go along. We become, we would say, more mature, but maybe also less mature by changing our minds and admitting that we were wrong. Or, in the old theological language, this is repentance, conversion, all that goes into it also. But let me talk about some very practical issues. Talk about LGBT issue in the church, for instance. So I'm sort of trying to explain this in very down-to-earth terms. A lot of liberal churches have done a great job saying, we're open to everybody. We invite everybody. We bring people into the church. That's wonderful. But now the question is the relationship, right? If you bring people into a church who are different, does this change the church? And if it doesn't, something is missing. So in this liminal space where we're dealing with something that you don't know, that you're learning, that you're becoming acquainted with, something changes, something happens. And of course, once this happens in your personal relationships, I think there's a chance that this happens in your relationship with God as well. Because, in this sense, God, Jesus Christ, these are all liminal relationships where, if Jesus was here right now, well, of course, let me tell you this, Jesus is here right now, and we're not paying attention, right? One theological question that I ask my students all the time is, what is Jesus doing now? Because we have this theology, WWJD, what would Jesus do if he were here? But he's not, he's sitting on a throne somewhere. But no, with Jesus here, it's the same thing, right? Leading us into places that might be a little uncomfortable, out of the sanctuaries, into the streets, and so on. So these are just a couple of examples to explain a complex word like liminality, maybe being pushed out of your comfort zone, being changed, being transformed. So you want to transform the world, you have to be, and you will be transformed in the process. So hopefully that makes sense, but we can also drop big names now, philosophers and all that, but won't do it tonight. So thanks for your question, comment.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. Someone else is probably thinking it as well, if you have a question.
This goes back to something you said at the very beginning. I have been thinking for the last 8 months about the good German Christians between 1933 and 1945 and how that relates to today. And I want you to tell me how we can avoid falling into the same trap that those Christians did, because we're in the same boat. And I'm scared because I am seeing the same thing happen to us, and I'm beginning to see why those good German Christians did or did not do what they did. Because it's scary.
Yeah, thank you, yes.
And I don't know what to do. I want to do something more. And I don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know you can't answer that
No,
question,
I will say a few things, because this is important. And we growing up, when I did, we did a lot of research, talked to our parents and grandparents about what happened, why did you do what you were doing. The Methodist Church at the time, between 1933 and 45, basically decided we will stay out of this. So the Methodist Church at the time did not take the side of fascism, which is great. But once it was all over, they realized that it wasn't enough not to take the side of fascism by simply not doing anything. You're also part of the problem. And so that's part of that legacy, where you can say there were some people that didn't go along with the problem, but they didn't quite go forward with it either. So this is really what I want to talk about here, Because, as open-minded people, it might seem to us, there's all kinds of ways to look at God. Many of us want to be interreligiously active. So if you can accept God in other traditions, why can you not accept the God of Christian nationalism, right? At one point, one of my colleagues said, capitalism is a religion, and therefore we have to have an interreligious dialogue with capitalism. To which some of my colleagues from Latin America said, you cannot have an interreligious dialogue with a heresy. You see what's going on. So on the one hand, as we become broader and more acceptable and more open, we're sort of trained to be in dialogue with everything. But now we have to figure out where we cannot go. And in Germany, it should have been clear, you cannot go into the concentration camp situation. You cannot go into killing 6 million Jewish people. And by the way, if you don't know it, there were another 5 or so million that were also killed, people who were labor leaders, socialists, communists, LGBT, disabled people, gypsy, and so on. And the church wasn't there. So what's going on? This is why we're doing this work here. These Abrahamic images of God I introduced tonight. On the one hand, they affirm who God is, but they also reject certain images. So there's both an affirmation and a rejection. And the rejection part, I think, is the one that's important now. How far can we go? If God is working through Jesus, can God also work through Caesar? That was that first slide of the Jesus versus Caesar book. And I think, the old confession, Jesus is Lord, really meant Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. So that already gives you a little bit of a theological sense of what has to be rejected. So claims to be God, claims to divinity by powers that are obviously not from God, we have to worry about. So while we have to be we can be interreligiously engaged, there are some things we cannot go along with. But that is usually happening now within our own field. Now, what about the courage? I think the reason we don't have the courage is oftentimes we're not quite sure we're on the right side of history, right? And so this is why we need theology. This is why we need community, where we have to reaffirm each other. You're not crazy. You're not just out there doing some wild card thing, but this is how we read the Bible. This is how we understand the Christian faith. This is how the Holy Spirit is at work. This is what Jesus is doing now. So building this courage gradually. And there's really no point to just stand on a soapbox and speak truth to power if power is not listening. That has to be built also in much more everyday lives. But this is why the church is now important. Not just to get a little sermon once in a while, but to build this identity together that now helps us to decide what's right, what's wrong. By the way, this is the story of the Methodist Open Table. Keep that in mind. The invitation to the table is not, y'all come. It doesn't say, y'all come. In the Methodist liturgy, if you haven't memorized it, Christ our Lord invites to his table all who earnestly love him, who repent of their sin and want to live in peace with one another. So if you do not repent of your sin, and if you do not want to live in peace with one another, you're not invited to the open table. Now, here's the beautiful thing. By actually drawing this line, and that takes some courage, that takes some guts, you're now opening up a whole new world for more people. So the table becomes fully open when you draw the line in these wolves in sheep clothing that are ultimately deadly for you and your community and for the world. And you build a community where so many others are welcome, that now feel this is the place where we can do this together. And one thing I can tell you for sure, it may feel scary right now, but you're not alone. I mean, there's so many of us. And in the end, I guarantee you, there's more of us than them. That too is part of history. So.
You mentioned the word solidarity. What does that look like in our current political climate? How can our nation find solidarity when there's so much division?
Yes, thank you. So this is really the conversation for the workshops tomorrow. So the answer to that question we'll spend tomorrow morning and early afternoon discussing, but I'll give you a couple of ideas just to, for those who might not be able to come back. The first thing about solidarity is to unmask false solidarity, because these things are put out there to fool people. This is not an accident. Racism is not somehow dropped from the sky because people are racist. Racism has always been used, and in our history especially, by those who use it to build their own power. And it's always the power of the few over the many. So once we understand that these unite and conquer tactics ultimately are usually meant to benefit the few, the rest of us are free to do something else. And so if you're a white person with a lot of white privilege, like myself, for instance, then you can say, okay, so if this wasn't meant for me, then what do I do, right? Now I can reorient myself. Tomorrow we'll talk about the difference between privilege and power. Once you realize your power is limited, then you might use your privilege differently. So once you realize as a white person, you may be white, you have a lot of privilege, but you're not changing this world by yourself, you then start building power differently. If I want to make a difference, the world tells me all I have to do is fly around the world and give big lectures, which is what I usually do. But the reality is me realizing we can only do this together, and then the thing changes. So even people with a lot of privilege now realize that solidarity might be a beneficial thing, might be finding ways of putting themselves in solidarity that are not just moral appeals, but deep existential needs. So solidarity now is really the message of God's grace, how we can actually be human together in a way that is much more life-affirming than what we have right now. But it's a struggle. I mean, it doesn't come naturally, but it's always there. That's like God's grace too. As Methodists, we believe in prevenient grace. God's always at work, and that's what we have to figure out. And I believe it's there. So we'll talk more about how it happens tomorrow. So thanks.
So you mentioned the transition from the mindset of, well, let us be kind to different people, to difference itself might be a part of the solution. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. It sounds like such, politically correct thing to say that, we're happier if there's more of us together, but, an old story an old image that sometimes is used if you have a fruit salad, right? And you have different, fruits in the salad, it's more tasty than it's all just watermelon, so in that sense, difference here, this is a different image from the old melting pot, where you have to melt everything together and then it becomes one thing. So difference here can be very happy, you can have, back in Europe, Benetton, the United Colors of Benetton, it's not so famous here in the US, but that was the big image, the more colors, the happier, and so on. That's sort of a very shallow stab at the notion of difference, because it's just, we're just happy to celebrate our differences. In real life, of course, we're welded together in all kinds of ways, and so, for instance, for people to realize, if a new house is built or construction happens, immigrant labor is actually mostly what's building your house. And then to say, this is how we live together. This is our lives, and let's recognize the contributions that everybody makes. So all of a sudden now, not just to say, oh, it's so nice that people in the construction industry talk Spanish mostly, but to say, houses would not be built without this. This is valuable contributions. This is people without which we would not be who we are, you know. So to figure out more the actual connections that are actually there, you know, or if you think about, I mean, that goes back to liminality again, you know, where you have people that might look at each other suspiciously, you know, being worried about, you know, what is this person doing, what is that person doing. I'll give you an example from sexuality. This was a question I was asked in New Zealand recently. Said, what about LGBTQIA+? And I said, well, you know, people say the church always wants to talk about sexuality. All right, let's talk about sexuality. And I said, the US statistics that I know are actually saying that more sexual abuse happens in families than anywhere else. Heterosexual families, that is, right? And so we think of the heterosexual family as the great model for how we relate to each other. That's, of course, the big conservative paradigm. Now it's all about the family. Yet, at the same time, these families are actually places of abuse. A lot of them are. Now, what about same-sex relationships? Well, they're not automatically sanctioned. They can also be abusive. But what if there are same-sex relationships that are not abusive? Maybe we can learn something from that. In other words, you know, if you're a straight person affirming LGBTQ, you might say, you know, maybe we can learn something from how different people live together. The old heterosexual image, where the man is the household, the head of the household, and the woman stays home and cooks, that comes from the 1950s. This is not how humanity has always lived. In fact, women have always been part of the contributing entity. And so you see what I'm saying? Now, once you look at the contributions that people can make, the LGBTQ thing now is not just let's be tolerant, but maybe we can find better ways of living together. By the way, Jesus said as much when he was visited by his brothers and by his sisters and his mother, right? He said, who are my brothers and my sisters and my mother? You know, try that with your mother, and she might not be happy to say, it's not you, but it's actually, well, who is it? People who are doing the will of God. So there's no identity test, and you have to look this way or that way, or you have to have DNA in common. No, it's doing the will of God. And of course, it's possible your family is also doing the will of God. Hey, that's great, celebrate that. But if it isn't, that's another false solidarity, where sameness and homogeneity actually holds us back in the old and doesn't allow us to live into something that's new. That is the Jesus movement as far as I'm concerned. So a movement that is very diverse disciples, very diverse people with Jesus on the way, some women on the way also. Luke 8, there are some wealthy, prominent women on the way with Jesus. And they probably took some flack for that, probably from their husbands and from their communities and from the service league. But at the same time, they were the ones who were part of making a difference, making history, whereas the other ones, you know, who talks about Pontius Pilate's wife now? Don't care. So anyways, you see, so there's some real wealth, some real richness there.
Any other questions?
And I promise I will give shorter answers, so don't. I know time is coming to an end.
Well, again, I'd like to remind folks, if you're available tomorrow to come to one or all workshops, that would be fantastic. If you could just let us know on the back of the form. You can hand me the slip, or there'll be baskets in our welcome area. And we're gonna have some snacks, and books will be available out in our welcome area. And I'm just very appreciative, again, of all that you're presenting this evening, and you'll continue for us this weekend. Yeah.
So one more comment, and this is sort of the practical side. We talked about a lot of ideas tonight, but we put these things together in what Aaron at one point, I think, who was the architect of it, and I called Solidarity Circles. So this is actually a program, a project for churches to do this work and to live into some of these things, to figure out relationships, to figure out new ways of being church, because that's the other piece, right? You want to transform the world, you better also be transformed in the process. And so we'll talk about this very specifically tomorrow, but if you're not here tomorrow and you want to know about this, you can look up our website. This is the Wendling Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt. Don't worry about that long name, but our website is religionandjustice.org. So type in religion and justice, one word, and then .org, and you see a lot of the work that we've been doing at Vanderbilt, and you'll see there's a little bar at the top. You click on solidarity circles, and you see how that actually applies to very practical work in the churches. And perhaps we can work on some of this also, because locally here in the Kansas City area, Erin now lives here, works for Heartland Presbytery. So there's some real roots that we're sinking into the Midwest, which is to me a new place, which I find very interesting in a way. You know, people always think of it as flyover country, but there are real things happening here. And as Barbara explained to me over dinner, this is a church that has a long tradition of that. So you don't even have to start from scratch. You start where you are, but there's still a few things I think we can build. So let's see what we can do. And stay in touch. If you're not able to come back, look up the websites. If you are, of course, Jeff knows where to find us. So thanks.
Thank you. Amen. All right, so let's head on out to the welcome area and enjoy some cookies and books.